This story is about an alien student trying to understand why humans celebrate death, but what she discovers at a funeral and the unexpected hug she receives changes everything. A quiet, powerful journey into grief, memory, and what it really means to be human. The first time Orilu saw a human funeral, she thought it was a form of psychological warfare. She hadn't meant to intrude. It happened during her cultural integration year on Earth, a planet whose inhabitants regularly baffled the Interstellar Education Coalition with their chaotic creativity and emotional resilience. Orilu was a first-year interspecies sociology student from the planet Serix 4, tall and gray-skinned, with the elongated pupils and smooth cranial plate that marked her people. Logical, observant, distant. She had been assigned to St. Joseph's University in upstate New York, where the humans smiled too much, spoke too fast, and used idioms as if language were some kind of competitive sport. Orilu's mentor, Professor Blake Morton, was a steady presence amid the storm. A tall man in his late 40s with a grizzled beard and a limp from an old construction accident, Blake had a way of explaining the messiness of human nature that made it almost make sense. Almost. Then his mother died. It was unexpected. A fall in the garden, a cerebral hemorrhage, and 3 days later, the machines went quiet. Orilu watched the shift happen in Blake. His lectures grew sparse, his eyes glacier. He didn't cry, but he stopped grading papers. His gestures slowed, as if every movement carried weight. When he resumed classes a week later, he invited Orilu to the funeral. "Only if you're comfortable," he said, voice hoarse. "Might help you understand us better." Orilu had many questions but asked none. Instead, she accepted the invitation. The funeral was held at a chapel near the woods. Orilu arrived early, standing awkwardly in the back corner. She wore the assigned black dress, though it hung strangely on her angular frame. No one questioned her presence, though a few glanced at her large reflective eyes with restrained curiosity. Then the humans arrived, in waves. Some wore somber expressions, but many smiled. They hugged. They laughed quietly in corners. Children tugged at their parents' coats and asked if Grandma was in heaven yet. Orilu approached the casket, peered in, and had to steady herself. Blake's mother lay there, unmoving, waxy and small. A man placed a small pink rose beside her hand. A teenage girl whispered, "She always made the best pancakes." Orilu found Blake standing near the pews. His eyes were red, but he gave her a nod. She approached cautiously. "I do not understand." Blake gave a tired chuckle. "You're not the first. You are mourning, yet you smile. That's what humans do." He sat down on a nearby bench and gestured for her to join him. "We celebrate the life, mourn the loss, yes, but we try to remember the good. The laughs, the shared meals, the ridiculous arguments over holiday pies. It's how we carry them forward. But she is no longer alive. You have lost something irreplaceable." "Yes, and so we remember her fully, not just the loss. Otherwise, we drown in it." Orilu stared at the people around her, how they hugged, how they recalled memories as if competing for who could smile through tears the best. It was disorienting. She turned back to Blake. "This is a contradiction." He didn't deny it. "Yeah, we're kind of good at those." Then a man in his early 30s approached Blake, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hey, you holding up?" Blake nodded. "One breath at a time. I brought you those cinnamon bars, the ones your mom used to bake for the 4th. Blake's face softened. "Thanks, Rob." Orilu leaned closer. "Is this nourishment part of the ritual?" Blake stifled a snort. "Kind of. Food's how we share grief." "You'll see." After the service, they walked to a nearby community hall where tables were lined with homemade dishes. People mingled. Some cried. Some laughed too hard. Orilu tried a spoonful of mashed potatoes and found them deeply unsettling yet oddly comforting. She watched the room, absorbing it all. Later, as the crowd thinned, she sat quietly on the porch steps outside the hall. She didn't notice Blake until he sat beside her, holding a thermos of coffee. Not what you expected, huh? No. I anticipated solemnity, silence, perhaps even ritualized solitude. This was communal chaos. With food. Blake took a sip. Grief's messy. We just decided to do it together. Orlu tilted her head. Your species appears to resist despair by countering it with reminders of joy. It is inefficient, and yet it seems to work. Blake didn't answer at first. Then he reached out, slowly, and hugged her. Orlu stiffened. This is another part, Blake said softly. When words fail, when minds can't explain, we hold each other. She did not return the hug, but she did not pull away. She sat there long after he let go, looking at her hands, processing. Later that evening, back in her assigned dormitory, she opened her cultural log and recorded a new entry. Subject: human rituals, death. Observation: death is not simply mourned, it is narrated. The deceased are turned into stories. The pain is acknowledged, but paired with celebration. Hypotheses: this dichotomy may be key to understanding human psychological resilience. Conclusion: emotional contradiction appears not as malfunction, but as feature. Note: unexpected physical gesture, hug, was comforting despite initial aversion. Recommend further study. She closed the log. Her chest felt not light, but no longer hollow. And outside, the sun set over the hill, the trees cast long shadows, and somewhere a child laughed. Orlu didn't understand it all. But for the first time, she wanted to. The next funeral Orlu attended was not planned. A few months had passed since Professor Morton's mother was laid to rest, and the leaves had turned brittle. The cultural integration program rolled forward with its unpredictable rhythm, and Orlu's observational log grew dense with entries on everything from grocery store etiquette to the baffling persistence of game shows. But her thoughts often returned to that funeral. The contrast of laughter with loss haunted her academic mind like a melody she couldn't quite place. She began to visit local cemeteries, notebooks in hand, observing mourners from afar. She even volunteered at a hospice center twice a week, where humans met death with a combination of fear, dignity, and strangely poetic irreverence. She never brought it up directly with Blake again. He returned to teaching with more gray in his beard and slower steps, but with the same thoughtful tone. Then, one icy morning in February, Orlu's translator pinged. Subject: incident involving student volunteer staff. Please report to campus clinic immediately. When she arrived, she found Blake in the waiting area, eyes downcast, coat still dusted with snow. One of the hospice patients, Maryanne Greaves, had passed the night before. Cardiac arrest, confirmed by the coroner that morning. Orlu had sat with Maryanne twice. The woman had been a retired math teacher, thin and cheerful, with a tremor in her right hand and a passion for riddles. Orlu had not cried when she heard. But she'd gone quiet, uncertain what to feel. She left you something, Blake said as they walked toward the administrative office. A letter. Said she liked your curiosity. The envelope was small, handwritten. Inside was a short note. Dear Orlu, you're the first person to ever ask me why I wasn't afraid. I never answered properly. But I'll tell you this. The end is just a punctuation mark, not the story. Love, Maryanne. Orlu read the note 3 times. Then she asked Blake, "What is a punctuation mark?" Blake coughed a laugh. It's what we put at the end of a sentence to show it's finished. So death is grammar? In a way. 2 days later, a small memorial was held at the hospice garden. There were fewer people this time. No casket, no chapel. Just a stone bench and a table of tea. The hospice staff stood in a loose semicircle, sharing memories. Orlu listened to them speak, a nurse recounting Maryanne's complaints about oatmeal, a fellow patient who'd played Scrabble with her each Wednesday. Then a hospice worker read a poem Maryanne had written decades earlier. And then one of the workers, Eliza, turned to Orlu. "Do you want to say something?" There was a long pause. Orlu had not expected to be asked. She stepped forward. Maryanne said the end is not the story. I do not know yet what that means, but I believe her. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was full. Afterward, as the garden cleared, Eliza walked with her to the gate. "You've got a gentle way about you," she said. Orlu processed that quietly. Later that week, Blake invited her to dinner at his home. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house filled with books and half-repaired wooden furniture. There was soup on the stove and a photo of his mother on the mantel. They ate without much conversation until Orlu finally asked, "Why do you write obituaries?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "You've been reading those?" "Yes, daily. They are short, often formulaic, but reverent." He stirred his soup. "They're the last gift we give the living about the dead. One last summary, one last story." Orlu nodded slowly. "There is a pattern, a structure. You name the person, list their survivors, recall key events, then express hope they rest in peace. You reduce their existence to 2 paragraphs. Do you think that's wrong? I think it is human, to give form to grief by shaping it into words." Blake put down his spoon. "You've learned a lot since that first funeral. I have observed, but I do not yet understand why you do not fear the end more." "We do," Blake said, "just not always in the same way. Some of us pretend we don't. Some laugh at it. Some face it head on. But the fear isn't the end of the story either." Orlu leaned back. "You face death with rituals, food, stories, embraces, humor, and poetry. It is not efficient. It is not clean. But it softens the event." Blake smiled faintly. "We soften it so it doesn't break us." That night, Orlu dreamed of punctuation marks, giant commas floating in space, question marks orbiting stars, a single period blinking at the edge of the galaxy, waiting. She awoke with the realization that Maryanne's note had unsettled something in her. Not fear, curiosity. 2 weeks later, Orlu was asked to speak at a university panel on cultural grieving practices. She presented her findings: how humans coped with loss through layered expressions, how funerals served not only the dead but the living, and how emotional contradiction functioned as psychological armor. She ended her presentation with a photograph. It was from the hospice memorial. In it, she stood beside the stone bench, eyes lowered, the folded letter in her hand. "Grief," she said, "is a language. I am still learning to read it." The room was silent for several seconds before applause began. Afterward, an elderly professor approached her. "You've captured something we often forget. Thank you." Orlu nodded. She still didn't understand it all, but she was starting to recognize the shapes of things. And somewhere, quietly, she began to feel the tug of empathy, a sensation her people often warned against, but one she now believed was worth the discomfort. It was early spring when Orlu first asked the question aloud. She and Blake were standing by a lake near the campus arboretum, where the trees had begun sprouting tentative green. Students wandered the trails in light jackets, reveling in the first warm sunlight since winter. Orlu's question came quietly, but with focused intent. "Why do you celebrate death?" Blake took his time before answering. "We don't celebrate death," he said. "We celebrate the life that ended. There's a difference. But you hold gatherings. You laugh, you eat, you tell stories. These are the same mechanisms you use to celebrate births or marriages." Blake nodded slowly. "That's fair. I guess we're trying to balance things. We need the joy to carry the weight of the grief." "You are afraid to fall apart." "No," he said, turning to look at her. "We know we'll fall apart. We just try not to do it alone." Orlu let that settle between them. She had been preparing for this conversation for weeks. She had dissected obituary language, analyzed grief support forums, and even interviewed a funeral director in Albany. But none of it gave her the clarity she sought. The data never aligned. Because death, for her people, was simple. When a Syrixian died, the body was flash incinerated, the digital memory stored, if relevant, and the communal archive updated. Mourning was optional and typically short. The individual had fulfilled their role. The system moved on. But humans weren't systems. They were stories. Aurilu learned this most acutely a month later, when Blake collapsed. It happened during a faculty meeting. He'd been recovering from a respiratory infection, had waved off concern with the usual just a cough. But that day something in his chest gave out. He crumpled mid-sentence, eyes wide and unfocused. Aurilu was in the hallway when she heard the commotion. She arrived to see a paramedic pressing down on Blake's chest, a colleague shouting updates into a phone. His face had gone pale. Aurilu froze. Her knowledge of human anatomy screamed at her this was bad. Very bad. She didn't approach. She couldn't. Instead, she stood near the exit, hands trembling. Blake was rushed to the hospital. Emergency surgery followed. Ruptured artery, aortic dissection. The prognosis was grave. The doctors stabilized him. But the next 48 hours would be critical. Aurilu waited outside the ICU with the other faculty members. She remained seated, silent, her long fingers clasped tightly in her lap. When a nurse finally allowed them in, 2 at a time, Aurilu declined. She waited 12 hours before entering. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. Wires and tubes ran like tributaries from his body to machines that blinked and beeped in sterile rhythm. His chest rose shallowly, each breath assisted. Aurilu sat beside him. "You once said," she whispered, "that grief is language." She stared at the heart monitor. "Do not want to learn this dialect." Blake didn't stir. His skin was too pale. His left hand twitched, faintly, once. He stayed the night, refusing offers to leave. By morning, his vitals had stabilized. By the 3rd day, he opened his eyes. Recovery was slow, realistic. The surgeons explained the timeline clearly. He wouldn't return to teaching for at least 2 months. He'd need cardiac rehab. There would be fatigue, muscle weakness, occasional confusion from the anesthesia. Aurilu visited daily. At first she spoke little, simply sat with him while he dozed or watched the muted television. Then she began reading aloud bits of newspapers, fragments from academic journals. She avoided anything about death. One afternoon, 2 weeks into his recovery, Blake looked at her and rasped, "Why are you really here?" Aurilu blinked. "You are my advisor. You nearly died. This response is expected." "But that's not why." She hesitated. Then, quietly, "You hugged me. Once. At a funeral. It was illogical, but effective. Now I replicate the gesture." Blake smiled faintly. "It's not just about logic, kid. It's about presence." She didn't answer, but she stayed an hour longer that day. Word of Blake's recovery spread slowly. Students sent cards. One baked a loaf of sourdough with his name carved into it. The sociology department hosted a welcome-back event 3 months later, scaled down but heartfelt. Blake returned, thinner, slower, but with that same wry half-smile. At the gathering, Aurilu stood beside him while he answered student questions about mortality studies. When one student asked, "Were you scared?" Blake glanced at Aurilu, then said, "Yes. But I wasn't alone." That night, Aurilu updated her law. Observation. Human fear of death is profound but not paralyzing. Social bonds provide buffering. The presence of others appears to reduce existential isolation. Unexpected insight. Recovery rituals mirror mourning rituals. Cards, gifts, shared food, community reintegration. Conclusion. Celebration is not for death, but for the endurance of the living, for the survival of memory. Recommendation. Attend additional funerals, not for morbidity, but for data integrity. She paused before adding, "Addendum, if Blake had died, the ritual would have hurt. But I would have participated." And outside her dorm window, a late spring wind carried the sound of distant laughter. She turned off the light, unsure if what she felt was grief delayed or something else entirely. By the time summer settled over upstate New York, Orlulu understood just enough about humans to know she didn't understand them at all. And that, strangely, was enough. Blake had returned to teaching part-time, still undergoing weekly rehab sessions and forced to pause for breath more often than before. He kept an oxygen canister in his office, just in case, and sometimes wore a compression sock on his left leg when standing too long. He joked about it. At least now I have an excuse to cancel faculty meetings. Orlulu no longer flinched when he made jokes about his near-death experience. She had learned that gallows humor, for humans, was not disrespectful. It was rebellion against the quiet, against the inevitable, against the idea that silence should win. Her studies had expanded. She'd been approved for an independent research module, focusing on human mourning customs across different cultures and economic strata. The more she explored, the more variation she found. In some households, grief was private and cloaked. In others, it burst forth in song, in fire, in ceremonial tattoos. Orlulu cataloged them all, each with its own rhythm of ache. Then she received a message from Professor Aiden Prell, her Syrixian academic supervisor. Subject: pending rotation to lunar campus. Directive: prepare summary of cultural integration learnings. Timeline: 3 weeks. The message should have pleased her. It meant she had completed her term. Yet as she reread it, Orlulu felt something twist in her. It was Blake who noticed first. "You've been quieter," he said one afternoon, sitting across from her in the campus cafe. "I have received my reassignment orders," she said. He nodded slowly. "Back to the lunar base?" She hesitated. "Yes. They expect me to compile my findings and prepare them for presentation to the Interstellar Coalition. My immersion here is considered sufficient." Blake leaned back. "But you're not sure it is. I have observed much, but I still struggle to explain why you feel grief as both burden and gift." "Maybe that's not something you explain," he said. "Maybe it's something you live through." She looked away. "I do not know if I am capable of living through it the same way." "You're not supposed to. That's not the point. Just being present is enough." She didn't respond, but later that evening she took out the envelope Maryanne had given her. She reread the letter. The words still puzzled her. The next morning she received a second message. Subject: faculty memo. Note: Professor Lawrence DeWitt, anthropology, passed away yesterday after a brief illness. Memorial service to be held on campus quad. Orlulu had met Professor DeWitt twice, once at a lecture, once in the faculty lounge where he spilled tea on a student's thesis and apologized by gifting her a handmade bookmark. He was known for his sarcasm and fondness for clay figurines. She didn't know him well, but she went to the memorial. It was held outdoors, under the old elm tree that cast long shadows in the quad. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows. There were cookies on a folding table, and someone had brought a battered boombox playing instrumental jazz. People spoke. One shared a story about DeWitt's fondness for mislabeling museum artifacts just to keep interns sharp. Another recalled how he refused to use email unless threatened with 10-year review. Then a woman, his niece, stepped forward. "He said something to me last year," she said, voice trembling. "That death was just the final nudge toward becoming a memory, and that if you did it right, your memory gets annoying and persistent." Laughter, quiet and raw. Orlulu stood at the back, watching faces. So many faces, etched with affection, pain, gratitude. She realized it wasn't just about remembering the dead. It was about refusing to forget them. She found Blake after the service, seated on a bench, his hand resting over his chest as if checking that the rhythm still held. His gaze turned as she approached. "You came," he said. "I believe I understand now," she said softly. "Not fully, but enough." He looked at her. "You do not celebrate death," she said. "You celebrate the echo." Blake let out a breath, one that seemed to carry weeks of weight. Yeah, that's about right. She sat beside him. Professor DeWitt did not hug me. He never wrote me a note. And yet, I am changed by his departure. That's the echo. I will document it, she said, but not like before. I no longer think it can be captured in academic metrics alone. Then how? She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out and hugged him. Gently, carefully, but intentionally. Blake blinked, then chuckled as he returned to the gesture. You've come a long way, Orlu. I have, and yet I am still here. They stayed like that a moment longer. The sky overhead was streaked with orange, and somewhere on campus, wind rustled through the elms like whispers, remembering the names of the gone. A week later, Orlu boarded the transport shuttle bound for the lunar base. As she settled into her seat, she opened her log for one final entry. Final integration summary. Humans approach death not with clarity, but with community. Not with control, but with courage. They mark endings not to dismiss grief, but to bear it together. Their rituals are inconsistent. Their mourning is imprecise. Their expressions are tangled. But through story, through memory, through presence, they celebrate not the absence but the impact. They hug, they write, they laugh through tears. And through it all, they echo. She paused. I was hugged at a funeral. And I understood. She closed the log and smiled.